Welcome to the course Introduction to Urban Planning. Today is the concluding session of this course. So we'll look at what we covered and what our learning outcomes are in this course. We will look at what potential the cities bring and what challenges we need to address through urban planning, and how do we look at the future from the planner's perspective or architect, or from social scientist, economist, or from citizen's perspective. In the end, we will also look into our limitation and future scope of the domain and the course. The purpose of this course was to connect and explore with you the urban planning domain, look at the cities with a commitment to understand the basics and look at new challenges and approaches. Looking at the overall structure, we covered concept of urbanization, varied definition across the globe, urbanization pattern, and very purpose of urban planning. Constitutional provisions, we looked at what is available in our country and then the associated planning framework. We looked at different types and levels of plans, including perspective plan at global to state to city level. We looked at regional plan, development plan, local area plan, special purpose plan, with each one of them with case studies. We looked into the employment of our cities through contextualizing cities lecture series. And we looked into various urban issues with special focus on public health and urban planning. Lastly, we looked into the legal requirements for planning through planning legislation series. In our very first lecture, we covered concepts of the urban areas, where we explored the differences we experience between urban and rural areas in the Indian context. In the section differentiating the urban from the rural areas, we took an experiential and perception-based approach to understand the distinction, where we simply tried to understand the character of the city from our experience. Thereafter, we looked at some of the expressions, definitions provided by key authors and institutions in the domain of urban studies in the section concept of cities. Following that, we explored various definitions across the globe by different countries. In this, we learned how this definition, what we look at in the Indian context, is not only the one, but how it varies with the context and the landscape and the geography we see across. We also familiarize ourselves with different boundaries recognized in the urban planning domain in the section Geographical Boundaries of Urban Areas and Terminologies. We in this section also looked into the classification of urban areas and the local governing authorities in Indian context in the section Classification of Urban Areas and Local Governing Authorities in India. So we learned the structure, we learned the vocabulary, we learned the key concept, and we also saw what are the variations, what are the range of cities we are looking at or we have classified so far. At the end of this course today, where we have looked at varied transformation and we had developed our understanding, we see that the size of the city is changing. The distinction and boundaries of urban and rural areas are merging. Now we talk about urban mega city regions, urban fields and subnational cities. We see continuous landscape of urban development very close as we fancied in futuristic time. We can see here the example of Pearl River Delta megacity. As per the World Cities Report 2020 by UN Habitat, China has stitched together delta cities of Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen into the Greater Bay Area, the Pearl River, through infrastructure investment like high-speed rail and the world's longest overseas bridge. So you can see here in the image, look at the entire landscape where all the cities are there. The mega region population is like 70 million. In these regions, economies of agglomeration, closeness, proximity of factors of production, and the increased size and specialization of markets create more value at the local level. There are 29 largest mega regions in the world as listed in the report, Boss Wash being on the top, including New York, Washington, D.C., and Boston. In the process, we learned changing character of the cities and newer challenges and opportunities what cities were giving us. Reviews in the World Cities report indicate that despite agglomeration benefits, what benefits we are really talking about, despite those, the spatial concentration of people and firms has drawbacks. The rising land, housing, labor, congestion, and pollution costs all are potential outcomes from urbanization. These negative externalities eventually make the costs of living and conducting business challenging and may limit the competitive advantage of a given area. Furthermore, in the report, it is suggested that spatial agglomeration can intensify inequality. So, despite our economic development, we see that inequality may increase within and between cities in the national and global urban system. In the report, it is emphasized that national governments must properly manage their system of cities across the urban continuum in order to balance agglomeration benefits with the potential negative consequences of superstar city. Like we are looking at the competition, ranking, and so on. So, the consequences of superstar city formation that leaves smaller cities and rural areas behind. So, that needs to be taken care of. Further, in the second lecture, we reviewed urbanization and sustainable development to understand the need and significance of urban planning. In this lecture, we explored the concept of urbanization, how we measure urbanization, why cities grow. We looked at the global urbanization pattern and reviewed the relationship between urbanization and sustainable development. We had seen urban population will be much larger than the rural population. It is projected that by 2050, the world will be more than two-thirds urban, 68%. Roughly the reverse of the global rural-urban population distribution of the mid-20th century. We saw through reports that Africa and Asia are urbanizing more rapidly than other regions of the world, and 21st century, it is this part of the world, Africa and Asia, which will experience rapid urbanization and in a massive scale. We also saw a trend in our country. Furthermore, we also discussed with case studies that urbanization not necessarily indicates economic development or sustainability unless planned well. In the graph, you can see urbanization and per capita GDP in 2015. We also saw growing slums with urbanization. We also saw the location of the cities by population size and then the level of exposure to disaster. We discussed the challenge of environments, what problems we are facing in the cities. In our third lecture, we saw the constitutional provision of urban planning through 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act facilitates the process and strengthens the impact of planning by decentralization. So we tried to learn through this what all provisions are there and what is the intention of the nation here. Thereafter, we looked at different levels and types of plan with case studies for each one of them, from cases ranging from sustainable development goals, and we looked at Uttarakhand, we looked at Madhya Pradesh, we looked at Delhi cases, we looked at Maharashtra, Kerala, Goa, Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Gujarat, and so on. So we tried to look at cases from different areas. Moreover, we reviewed their interrelationship and purpose, content, process, tools, and maps. So we can learn how are they prepared and how you could review them and understand them and use them to attain the collective objectives for our cities. In the process, we also contemplated how our understanding was evolving and how our approach was changing towards guiding cities, development, and meeting day to day requirements of all the people. Further, in contextualizing cities series, we looked at the timelines from different geographies to understand our cities and our approaches towards shaping our cities. We saw from Egyptian civilization to the current times, we looked at how and when we started looking at the future cities, what was happening during the Industrial Revolution, when we adopted a liberalization path and we moved to sustainable agendas and inclusive cities, how our perspective was refocused on people-centric planning and inclusive planning. We started looking at differently abled people, gender concerns were raised, concerns for elderly and children were coming up. We looked at indigenous people concerns, people of color, people with different orientations. So all these voices were raised. So we looked at all of them very briefly. By looking at all these things, we really understood what are the different concerns of people when we deal with urban planning. We further looked into the terms like gentrification, broken window, creative cities, controlling cities, knowledge cities, right to cities. We also looked at Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizens' participation. We talked about drugs and crime concern in cities. We looked at the work of Jean Jacob, Kevin Lynch, Dolores Haddon, Harvey Milk. We also looked at Professor William Goldsmith's work and writings. So with this, we really understood how different understanding and perspective was coming into picture and how it was formulating our planning process and thoughts and our approach toward designing our cities. We also looked at how planning moved from physical planning to economic planning, from rigid planning to flexible planning, and large-scale drawing-based planning to people-centric planning. We also see how urban sociology studies also came in. We saw how eventually our economy was changing from agriculture to manufacturing and then to creative knowledge-based economy, how cities are now competing at the global level, how we are looking at cities as engine of growth, and we also look at how the idea is being propagated about better performance of the non-resource based economic, both from the perspective of GDP contribution and environmental concern. You can see here in the map which shows resource exporters and non-resource based exporters and then their share in GDP. Further moving on, we also reviewed transit-oriented development, clustering at different levels and scales. We walked through how once again our cities were transforming drastically and becoming smart with the use of internet, data, robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. We also reviewed how we started a journey of planning with the health concern and arrived at a point today where health is central focus all again. We did an entire series on public health and urban planning from WHO report, planning interventions at global level and our learning in the Indian landscape with pandemic, epidemics and endemic. In particular from Mumbai plague and Surat plague, so we derived our learnings from there, from legislation to urban governance. There have been questions on density, governance, health infrastructure, and public health in urban areas, and we also walked through research which helped us understand the city's performance based on these parameters. We also looked at government's intervention in this direction. Further, in this segment, we did series of urban issues. In the urban issues, we got a glimpse of what problems urbanization brings and how we are addressing them. Then we looked at selective urban issues. We looked at problems of housing in urban India. We looked at how do we really conceptualize what does adequate housing means. We looked at different interventions and what we have been doing so far to address them. We looked at culture and planning of cities, different approaches adopted for culture in cities. How do we really conceptualize it? What kind of theories are there? What kind of interventions are happening? And we also updated ourselves with the current initiative by the ministry. Likewise, we also looked into the environmental problems, which is one of the serious concern of today. We looked at issues covering the relationship between city growth and natural environment. We looked into the case of Africa. We also looked how London draft plan has addressed the issue of environment, how they have developed green infrastructure and they're looking towards the natural environment and also looking at developing sustainable infrastructure. We also looked at some of the issues like urban heat island in our course. Further in detail, we also covered the urbanization and slums issues. We tried to understand the concepts involved. We looked into the trends and different approaches. There are numerous issues and a lot of interventions which are happening at the global and national level. So we saw some of them. Further, we looked into entire domain of legislation through few lectures covering key legislation aligned with urban planning. We fundamentally tried to understand why legislations are required and what kind of problems we face when we take up different kinds of plan and apply planning tools. So looking at what kind of impact it might have on people's rights, their health and wealth, and what kind of conflict it might create. We saw various tools and missions. At the same time, we saw conflict with rights. And we looked at what regulations are available for us. Further, we tried to understand whatever approach we are taking, is that good or bad? How do you really make those judgments? Particularly in the introduction to planning legislation, we looked at rights, we looked at duties of the citizens, we looked at certain court cases where we covered conflicts. We looked at right-based approach. We also looked at the significance of legislation in current times. We also looked at the evolution of growth and planning legislation in Britain, UK. We also looked at the legislation development in the USA landscape. We looked at evolution again in a comparative basis in Indian landscape. We looked at in two segments, pre-independence phase, and then we looked at the post-independent phase of legislation development. We further covered Land Acquisition Act to certain detail, where we saw the issues of land, why government needs to acquire land, concept of eminent domain, right to property, history of land acquisition and relevant act. Likewise, we also looked into industrial development and the legal requirements for that. Then we looked into how we were proceeding in our timeline, how we were liberalizing, and then what kind of legislation came in for FDI, cluster development and promotion of special economic zones, and so on. Further, we looked at the environmental legal requirements. We looked at EIA Act of 2006. We also looked at the draft EIA 2020. We looked into the environmental concerns and initiatives which are being taken with respect to technology as well as at the urban planning level. We looked at the Comprehensive Environmental Pollution Index, critically polluted areas. We looked at coastal regulations zone, and then some other acts related with eco-sensitive zones, e-waste rules. Then we also looked into the newer guidelines which have been developed with respect to mainstreaming urban river management into master plan and then urban river management plan. These things we looked into while we were covering the environmental related acts, all the legal requirements related from the environmental issues and urbanization. In this segment, we looked at that. Further, we also covered the Cantonment Act and then also looked into the urban heritage conservation. So we had one session in culture, then we also looked at what are the legal tools which are available at this moment for the heritage conservation. In the 39th lecture, we looked at the zoning regulation, which is the most important and very strong tool available to the planners. We covered these regulations. We looked at the meaning and reviewed the purpose of this zoning. We discussed and listed aspects and principles with the help of draft Bhopal development plan and looked into overall relevance of the tool with its ground translation, like how much control we really need in case of developing our cities and how do we really exert those control over the city. So today we are summarizing our learning outcomes and we are looking beyond. So we saw that increasing investment in urban areas does not automatically address poverty and inequality. Many individuals and population groups in cities around the world are excluded from the benefits of urbanization. So we looked into all the things, the good and the bad, and what things to be taken care of, and where we had succeeded, where we failed. So such understanding will prepare you to look and contemplate about your cities and process in which you get involved. So we see that World Cities report inform us that we also need to take care of the rural migrants and informal sector as well, which is another population group that is frequently excluded from the benefits of urbanization, as well as a lot of group which we had talked about. We further see that the report emphasizes that any urbanization process, irrespective which country does it, it's very important to have institutions in place which make it inclusive. In an uncertain global economic developments, compounded with frequent catastrophic weather events and COVID-19 pandemic, we see that urban poverty and unemployment are going to grow in scale and extend in many countries. Problems are many, from poverty, resource, environment, disaster, energy, transportation, health. At the same time, we also understand that it is cities which shall also give the solutions. We see that, why do we really say that? Density supports economies of scale in the provision of critical public services like health, infrastructure. And we had seen that density was a key element how we defined cities. So we see that well-planned and managed cities are uniquely well equipped to respond to all hazards, including public health threats. We see that properly planned urban areas can also contribute to national development through the interaction that exists between rural and urban economies. Urban planning can play a key role in designing effective mitigation and adaptation strategies, which in turn will enhance the environmental and economic value of urban areas. Looking at the limitation, we did not cover, we did not get into the details of governance systems, we did not get into the details of municipal finance, urban investment, public participation, planning tools, monitoring urban policies, resilient cities, on nature-based solutions. Though we looked at many parts of it through different case studies, review of past evolution, reforms, and through the missions work, which we may look forward to cover through readings and future series. As per the World Cities report, re-emphasizing the importance and significance of cities, cities are where aspirations, ambitions, and other intangible aspects of life are realized for all, including economic opportunities for marginalized groups. So, reflecting back to our beginning sessions where we looked at these aspects like why we all aspire to come to cities. So we look at what fulfillment does the city does for us. However, the greatest challenge to ensure equity is not in the amount of resources directed at a problem, rather, it is ensuring that lives of vulnerable and other marginalized groups are valued within the public policy and the processes we adopt in urban planning. Effective urban planning and management need to be proactive rather than reactive, as uh, this is very key to address the quality of life for the urban residents. Coming to the key question for you in the end of the course is to contemplate how you want your future to be and how do we prepare ourselves with our people, with the power we have in hand and the tools we have for enabling our objectives, and then being aware of the environmental impacts, being aware of the social impact. How do we really use those tools and powers together with the rural and the urban community, together with the diverse communities, and also being conscious about the environment and having a true sense of what really we want. Keeping all that in perspective, how do we really look at our future? How do we construct and deconstruct our plans, policies, institutions, resources, culture, and technology to reach our future and aspired tomorrow? Ending with the World Cities Report, learning key factor in improving the quality of life of urban residents is effective urban planning and management, and it's important to be being proactive rather than being reactive. Our coverage was limited with the scope to make you aware of the topic. There are enormous readings and movies available to explore. Few are suggested here. This is not an extensive list. You may feel free to suggest more from your experience. Please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about your concerns you have. Do share your opinion, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring cities and urban planning. So that's all for this course. We have covered all the aspects what we had planned for. So this is the concluding class, and we hope that you enjoyed your learning with us. Thank you so much.